What happens when the fairy tale cracks before the ink is dry on the marriage certificate? Did a broken tiara foretell a troubled reign? Could a groom's drunken disgust at the altar set the stage for a national crisis? We see the grand photos, the perfect smiles, the waving crowds. But behind the velvet ropes and the ancient traditions, royal weddings are high-stakes events where personal feelings crash into political necessity. Sometimes they go wrong, horribly wrong. From a wedding celebration that ended in a deadly stampede to a queen who was locked out of her own coronation by her husband, these are not the stories you find in the official programs. They are the messy human and often disastrous details that get left out of the history books. Number 16 was Queen Victoria's dream wedding, a public relations nightmare. Queen Victoria's wedding cake was a spectacle. It weighed nearly 300 pounds. It stood 3 feet high and had a circumference of about 9 feet. The Queen herself proposed to her groom, Prince Albert, an act that reversed centuries of royal protocol. She also single-handedly started the trend for white wedding dresses, a choice that was considered strangely modest and even cheap by the aristocrats of her day. They were used to royals marrying in silver or gold cloth to show off wealth. The wedding of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on February 10th, 1840, is remembered as the start of a great royal love story. But the lead-up and the day itself were filled with political tension and public spectacle that bordered on chaos. The problems began long before the vows. Parliament was deeply suspicious of Albert. He was a foreigner, a German prince from a minor duchy. They worried about his influence over the young 20-year-old queen. This suspicion turned into a public humiliation for the couple. For Parliament debated Albert's status with brutal frankness. They refused to grant him the title of king consort. They also slashed his proposed annual income from £50,000 to £30,000. This was a direct and very public snub. It sent a clear message. Albert was not an equal. He was a paid companion, a prince with a title but little real power. Victoria was furious. She wrote in her diary about the shameful and spiteful actions of the politicians. This political battle cast a dark shadow over the wedding preparations. It was a disaster before the first guest even arrived. The day itself was no fairy tale. The weather in London was dreadful. It was cold, with relentless rain and sleet. Despite this, enormous crowds gathered. The route from Buckingham Palace to the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace was overwhelmed. The planning was insufficient for the sheer number of people who wanted to see their young queen. Contemporary accounts describe a chaotic scene. People pushed and shoved. Barricades were strained. It was less a stately procession and more of a public mob. Inside the chapel, things were not much better. Victoria was visibly stressed. She was a young woman under immense pressure, marrying a man who had just been publicly insulted by her own government. She was reportedly very pale. Observers noted that she looked small and overwhelmed by the heavy satin gown and the weight of her ceremonial duties. Her famous white dress, made from Spitalfields silk and Honiton lace, was a deliberate choice to support English industries. But it was still a heavy, elaborate garment. She wore a wreath of orange blossoms instead of a tiara, a symbol of innocence. After the ceremony, the couple had a wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace. There was no grand public reception as we might imagine today. They left in the afternoon for Windsor Castle. The journey was again mobbed by crowds, despite the awful weather. The first few days of their marriage were not a secluded honeymoon. They were surrounded by courtiers and politicians. The political fallout from Parliament's decision about Albert's allowance lingered. It created an awkward and tense atmosphere within the royal household. Albert himself felt the sting of his reduced status keenly. He was a proud and intelligent man, but in the early years of his marriage, he had no defined role. He was the Queen's husband, but he was not her political equal. He had to fight for every scrap of influence and respect. The wedding, instead of cementing his position, had actually highlighted his vulnerability and dependence on his wife's authority. The disastrous political maneuvering before the wedding shaped the first decade of their marriage. It took years for Albert to carve out a meaningful role for himself and earn the respect of the British establishment. The perfect wedding image hides a much messier reality of political fighting and personal humiliation. Number 15, did a broken tiara nearly derail Queen Elizabeth II's wedding? On the morning of her wedding, Princess Elizabeth's tiara snapped in half. The piece was the Queen Mary's fringe tiara, a delicate diamond Kokoshnik-style headdress made in 1919. As the hairdresser was securing her veil, the frame of the tiara gave way. The court jeweler was immediately summoned. He was rushed through London traffic with a police escort to his workshop to perform an emergency repair. He managed to solder it back together just in time for the princess to leave for Westminster Abbey. Photos from the day show a small visible gap in the center of the tiara's spikes where the break occurred. The wedding of Princess Elizabeth to Philip Mountbatten on November 20th, 1947, took place in a Britain that was still recovering from war. The country was broke. Rationing was a part of daily life. This context made the very idea of a grand royal wedding a political disaster waiting to happen. The Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, was wary of the expense. They feared that a lavish spectacle would look terrible when so many citizens were struggling. There was serious debate about whether the wedding should be a small private affair to reflect the mood of the nation. The public, however, wanted the fairy tale. They craved a moment of celebration after years of hardship. The government eventually relented, but the theme of austerity defined the entire event. Elizabeth had to save up clothing ration coupons to pay for the material for her wedding dress. The government granted her an extra 200 coupons, but women from all over the United Kingdom sent their own coupons to the princess to help. These had to be returned, as it was illegal to transfer them. The gesture showed the public's investment in the day. The dress itself, designed by Norman Hartnell, was made of ivory silk duchesse satin. It was decorated with 10,000 seed pearls and crystals. But even this was a source of controversy. The silk was sourced from a silk farm in Kent, but the silkworms themselves were from nationalist China, not a friendly nation at the time. The pearls were purchased from the United States. Questions were raised in Parliament about the appropriateness of using materials from overseas when British industry was struggling. The guest list was another minefield. Due to post-war sensitivities, several of Philip's German relatives were not invited. This included his 3 surviving sisters, who had all married German princes. The Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward V, was also not invited. This was a clear sign of his continued exclusion from the family after his abdication. These omissions highlighted the deep scars left by recent history and the unresolved tensions within the royal family itself. The wedding day was broadcast by BBC Radio to an estimated 200 million people around the world. It was a huge media event, but the logistics were a challenge. The procession route was shorter than for previous royal weddings to manage costs and security. The wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace was also relatively modest by royal standards. The main course was partridge. The cake, which was 9 feet tall and weighed 500 pounds, was a gift from the Australian Girl Guides. It became known as the 10,000-mile cake because its ingredients were sourced from all over the Commonwealth to symbolize global support. After the wedding, pieces of the cake were sent to charities and organizations. Even the honeymoon was impacted by the austere times. The couple spent their first night at Broadlands in Hampshire, the home of Philip's uncle, Lord Mountbatten. They then traveled by train to Balmoral in Scotland, but the reality of post-war Britain followed them. The royal train was old and drafty, the weather was freezing, the honeymoon was not the idyllic escape people might imagine. The broken tiara was a small, frantic disaster on the day, but the real disaster was the tightrope the royal family and the government had to walk. They had to stage an event that was grand enough to lift the spirits of a nation, but not so extravagant that it seemed insensitive to the widespread suffering and poverty that defined post-war Britain. Number 14 was Marie Antoinette's wedding celebration cursed from the start. During the public celebrations for the wedding of Marie Antoinette and the future Louis XVI, a fireworks display went horribly wrong. On May 30th, 1770, a massive crowd gathered in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. A stray firework set fire to some of the wooden scaffolding used for the display. Panic erupted. The crowd surged, trying to flee the area. In the stampede, people were crushed and trampled. The official death toll was 132, but many historians believe the number was much higher. with some estimates reaching over 300. It was a horrific tragedy that cast a dark omen over the marriage. The marriage itself was a political arrangement designed to seal an alliance between two long-standing enemies, the Bourbon dynasty of France and the Habsburg dynasty of Austria. Marie Antoinette, just 14 years old, was the pawn in this game. Her journey from Vienna to France was a carefully staged theatrical production, but it was also a brutal lesson in her new reality. At the border, on a neutral island in the Rhine River, she was subjected to a ceremony known as the Remise. She was stripped of all her Austrian clothing, her servants, her friends, and even her pet dog. Everything she owned was taken from her. She had to enter France with nothing from her past, dressed head to toe in French garments. She was no longer an Austrian archduchess. She was the Dauphine of France. This systematic erasure of her identity was a deeply traumatic and isolating experience for a young girl. The wedding ceremony took place at the Palace of Versailles on May 16th, 1770. The groom, the 15-year-old Dauphin Louis, was notoriously shy, awkward, and indecisive. He showed little interest in his new bride. The wedding itself was lavish. Marie Antoinette's dress was so heavily adorned with diamonds and pearls that she could barely stand up in it. The court was a snake pit of etiquette and intrigue. The young Austrian princess struggled to navigate the complex rules and the hostile factions. Many at court resented the Austrian alliance and saw her as an unwelcome foreigner. The wedding night was a public and humiliating disaster. The couple was escorted to their bedchamber by the king, Louis XV, and the entire court. It was a tradition for the royal couple to be publicly put to bed to ensure the marriage was on the right track. But the marriage was not consummated. Louis seemed completely uninterested in his wife. This failure continued for 7 years. The lack of an heir became a national obsession. It was the subject of crude jokes, gossip, and vicious political pamphlets. This personal failure had huge political consequences. A royal marriage was supposed to produce heirs to secure the dynasty. Their inability to do so was seen as a sign of weakness and dysfunction at the very top of the monarchy. It undermined their authority and made them look ridiculous. Marie Antoinette was blamed. Rumors spread that she was promiscuous, that the fault lay with her. The reality was likely that Louis suffered from a medical condition, possibly phimosis, that made intimacy painful. He eventually had a small operation, and the couple went on to have children. But the damage was done. The first 7 years of their marriage were defined by this very public and very personal failure. The fireworks disaster, the stripping of her identity, the awkward groom, the unconsummated marriage, and the hostile court. Marie Antoinette's wedding was not a fairy tale. It was a series of personal and public disasters that set the tone for her tragic life. The joy of the wedding was literally extinguished by death and panic in the streets of Paris. It was a terrible beginning that foreshadowed an even more terrible end. Number 13. Why did Anne of Cleves' first meeting with her husband ruin everything? When Henry VIII first saw his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, in person on New Year's Day, 1540, he was so excited to meet the woman from the famous portrait by Hans Holbein that he decided to surprise her. He burst into her rooms at Rochester, disguised and unannounced, in the old tradition of courtly love. Anne, who spoke no English and had been raised in a formal, sheltered German court, had no idea who this large, boisterous man was. She was polite but confused and unimpressed. Henry was mortified. He had expected to be recognized and adored. Instead, he was met with a blank stare. The surprise was a complete disaster. The marriage had been arranged for purely political reasons. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, had pushed for the match. He wanted to build an alliance with the Protestant princes of Germany to counter the Catholic powers of France and Spain. Anne's brother was the Duke of Cleves, a powerful figure in this Protestant league. The marriage was a diplomatic move, a piece on a European chessboard. The problem was that Henry had to actually marry the woman. His decision was based almost entirely on the portrait by Holbein. The artist had painted a flattering, delicate image of the 24-year-old German noblewoman. Henry was pleased with what he saw. He agreed to the match without ever meeting her. When he finally saw her in the flesh at Rochester, his disappointment was immediate and absolute. He complained loudly to his courtiers, "I see nothing in this woman as men report of her," he is said to have declared. He famously and cruelly referred to her as the Flanders mare. Despite his deep misgivings, the wedding had to go ahead. The diplomatic arrangements were too far advanced to be cancelled without causing a major international incident. The wedding took place just 6 days later on January 6th, 1540, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. It was a low-key, miserable affair. Henry was in a foul mood throughout the ceremony. He reportedly wore a frown and barely spoke to his new bride. There was no joy, no celebration. It was the grim fulfillment of a contract he desperately wanted to escape. The wedding night was an even bigger disaster. Henry was unable to consummate the marriage. He later gave his doctors and ministers graphic and embarrassing details about his failure, blaming Anne's appearance entirely. He claimed he could never be stirred to know her carnally. For Anne, who had been raised to believe her duty was to obey her husband and produce heirs, this must have been a deeply confusing and humiliating experience. The marriage was a political and personal catastrophe from the moment they met. Henry was obsessed with finding a way out. He put immense pressure on Cromwell, the man who had arranged the match. Cromwell's political survival now depended on undoing the marriage he had worked so hard to create. Lawyers were set to work looking for any possible loophole. They found one. Anne had been previously betrothed to Francis, Duke of Lorraine. Although the betrothal had been cancelled, it provided the flimsy legal pretext Henry needed. He argued that she was not free to marry him. Just 6 months after the wedding, the marriage was annulled. Anne, showing remarkable intelligence and political skill, did not fight the annulment. She agreed to the king's terms. She testified that the marriage had never been consummated and accepted a new title, the king's beloved sister. This smart move saved her life. Unlike some of Henry's other wives, she was not executed or exiled. She was given a generous settlement, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn. She lived out the rest of her life in England in comfort and dignity. She even maintained a friendly relationship with Henry and his children. The wedding was a complete disaster. It ended the career and ultimately the life of Thomas Cromwell, who was executed for treason shortly after the annulment. But for Anne of Cleves, the disastrous marriage led to a surprisingly peaceful and independent life. She played a bad hand perfectly and survived. Number 12. Did Caroline of Brunswick's groom hate her on sight? When the Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, first met his bride to be Caroline of Brunswick, he was so horrified that he turned to his courtier and said, "I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He then spent the rest of the evening in a drunken stupor. Caroline, for her part, was not impressed either. She later remarked that the prince was very fat and he's nothing like as handsome as his portrait. This first meeting set the tone for one of the most disastrous royal marriages in history. The marriage, which took place on April 8, 1795, was a business transaction. Prince George was extravagant and deeply in debt. His father, King George III, agreed to pay off his debts, but only if he married a suitable German princess. Caroline was chosen. She was the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick, and her mother was the sister of King George III. On paper, she was a perfect match. In reality, the two were completely incompatible. George was already secretly and illegally married to a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, whom he adored. He resented being forced into this new marriage. He was a man of fashion and refinement, while Caroline was seen as loud, undignified, and lacking in personal hygiene. All reports from the time suggest she rarely bathed and had poor table manners. This repulsed the fastidious prince. The wedding ceremony at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace, was a spectacle of misery. The groom was so drunk that he had to be held up at the altar by his supporters. He reportedly wept during the vows. Caroline was calm and composed, but she was entering a marriage with a man who clearly despised her. The wedding night was the final disaster. According to Caroline's own account, the prince spent most of the night passed out drunk in the fireplace, having stumbled into the room and collapsed. The marriage was over before it began. They managed to perform their dynastic duty, and Caroline gave birth to a daughter, Princess Charlotte, 9 months later. After that, they lived completely separate lives. George restricted Caroline's access to their daughter and did everything he could to humiliate her publicly. He barred her from court and encouraged the spread of vicious rumors about her behavior. Caroline eventually left England and traveled around Europe, living an eccentric and scandalous life. Her behavior was certainly unconventional, but it was fueled by years of mistreatment and public rejection by her husband. The disaster of their wedding day bled into decades of mutual hatred. When George III died in 1820, George IV ascended the throne. He was determined that Caroline would not be his queen. He tried to divorce her, introducing a bill in Parliament called the Pains and Penalties Bill to dissolve the marriage and strip her of her title on the grounds of adultery. This turned into a massive public relations disaster for the new king. The public, who despised the decadent and selfish George IV, rallied behind Caroline. They saw her as a victim. The divorce proceedings were like a soap opera, with lurid details of Caroline's life abroad being debated in the House of Lords. The bill was eventually dropped due to a lack of support, a huge public defeat for the king. The final act of this disastrous marriage came at George IV's coronation on July 19, 1821. Caroline, still legally the Queen of Great Britain, traveled to Westminster Abbey to claim her right to be crowned alongside her husband. She was physically barred from entering. She tried several doors, only to be turned away by armed guards. It was a moment of ultimate public humiliation. Broken and defeated, Caroline fell ill shortly after. She died just 3 weeks later. Her wedding was not just a single disastrous day. It was the start of a 26-year war between a husband and wife that scandalized the nation and nearly brought down the monarchy. Number 11. Was Mary, Queen of Scots' second marriage a political suicide mission? Mary, Queen of Scots, married her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, at 6 a.m. in her private chapel at Holyrood Palace. The early morning timing was chosen to minimize public attention and potential protests. The ceremony on July 29, 1565, was a Catholic one, which was a deeply provocative act in a Scotland that was officially Protestant. Many of the leading Scottish lords, including her own half-brother, the Earl of Moray, were so opposed to the match that they rose in a rebellion known as the Chase-About Raid. Mary's wedding, therefore, was not a unifying event. It was an act of defiance that immediately triggered a civil war. The choice of groom was the core of the disaster. Lord Darnley was Mary's first cousin. They shared a grandmother in Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. This gave Darnley a strong claim to the English throne, just like Mary. For this reason, the marriage was seen as a direct threat by Queen Elizabeth I of England. It combined two strong Catholic claims to her throne, creating a powerful rival force. Elizabeth had expressly forbidden the marriage and was enraged when Mary went ahead with it. The wedding destroyed any chance of a peaceful relationship between the two queens. On a personal level, Darnley was a terrible choice. He was tall and handsome, which initially attracted Mary, but he was also arrogant, vain, immature, and a violent drunk. He was consumed by ambition. He was not content to be the queen's husband. He demanded to be made King of Scots with equal power to Mary, and for the crown to pass to his heirs even if Mary died. Mary gave him the title of king on the morning of their wedding, but she refused to grant him the crown matrimonial, which would have given him the power he craved. This refusal turned Darnley against her. Their marriage quickly descended into a nightmare. He was jealous and suspicious. He became involved in plots with the same Protestant lords who had rebelled against the marriage. This led to one of the most shocking events in Scottish history. In March 1566, a heavily pregnant Mary was having supper with her friends and her private secretary, David Rizzio, at Holyrood Palace. A group of armed men, led by Lord Ruthven and accompanied by Darnley himself, burst into the room. They dragged the terrified Rizzio out and stabbed him to death, leaving his body with 56 wounds. Darnley's involvement in the murder of his wife's friend in front of her, while she was pregnant, was an unforgivable betrayal. The love Mary may have had for him turned to disgust and hatred. The marriage was completely broken. Though she gave birth to their son, the future King James VI and I, their relationship was purely for appearances. The disastrous wedding had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy Mary. Less than 2 years after the wedding, On the night of February 10th, 1567, the house where Darnley was staying at Kirk O' Field in Edinburgh was destroyed by a massive explosion. Darnley's body was found in the garden, apparently smothered. He had not died in the blast. Suspicion immediately fell on James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, and on Mary herself. Whether she was involved in the plot to murder her husband is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. But just 3 months later, she married the chief suspect, Bothwell. This was the final political disaster. It turned the Scottish nobility and the Scottish people against her. It seemed to confirm her guilt in Darnley's murder. Another rebellion rose and Mary's forces were defeated. She was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of her infant son, James. She eventually fled to England, seeking the protection of her cousin, Elizabeth I. Instead of protection, she found 19 years of imprisonment, which ended with her execution. Her wedding to Darnley was not just a bad marriage. It was the catastrophic political miscalculation that led directly to the loss of her crown and her life. Number 10, did Eleanor of Aquitaine's first wedding trap, her in a loveless cage. Eleanor of Aquitaine was just 15 years old when she married the future King Louis VII of France in 1137. Days before the wedding, her father, the powerful Duke of Aquitaine, died unexpectedly. This meant that Eleanor, his oldest daughter, inherited a vast territory that was larger and wealthier than the lands controlled by the French king himself. The wedding, therefore, was a massive political coup for the French monarchy. It brought the huge and strategic Duchy of Aquitaine under the control of the French crown. For the pious and serious Louis, it was a dream come true. For the vibrant, worldly, and intelligent Eleanor, it was the beginning of a 15-year disaster. The couple were polar opposites. The French court was austere, conservative, and deeply religious. Louis was more like a monk than a king. Eleanor had grown up in the sophisticated and cultured court of Aquitaine, a place famous for its poetry, music, and more liberal attitudes. She found the French court stifling and boring. She found her husband dull. Louis, in turn, was shocked by his wife's worldliness and high spirits. He disapproved of her clothes, her friends, and her behavior. He loved her in his own way, but he could not understand her. The personal incompatibility was a major problem, but the real disaster of the marriage was their failure to produce a male heir. In 15 years, Eleanor gave birth to only 2 daughters. In a medieval monarchy, the primary duty of a queen was to provide a son to continue the dynasty. Their failure to do so was seen as a failure of the marriage itself and a sign of divine disapproval. It put immense strain on their relationship and on the stability of the kingdom. The breaking point came during the Second Crusade, where Eleanor, in an unprecedented move for a queen, insisted on accompanying her husband to the Holy Land in 1147. She brought her own retinue of ladies and vassals from Aquitaine. Her presence on the crusade was a source of constant friction. She and Louis disagreed on military strategy. Rumors swirled about her behavior. The most damaging was the gossip about her close relationship with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch. It was whispered that they were having an affair. There is no real evidence for this, but the rumors were enough to poison Louis's mind and humiliate him publicly. The crusade was a military failure, and the royal couple's relationship was in tatters. They barely spoke on the journey home. They even traveled on separate ships. The marriage was effectively over. They both wanted out. The problem was that divorce was not an option for a Catholic king and queen. They needed an annulment, a declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place. After years of negotiation and pressure, they were finally granted an annulment in March 1152. The official reason given was consanguinity. They were too closely related, third cousins once removed. This was a common excuse used by medieval aristocrats to end inconvenient marriages. The real reasons were personal incompatibility and the lack of a male heir. The annulment was a disaster for Louis and the French crown. The terms of the agreement meant that Eleanor's lands, the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, reverted to her. She was once again the most eligible heiress in Europe. Just 8 weeks later, she made her next move. She married the young and ambitious Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was 11 years younger than her. 2 years later, he became King Henry II, of England. Suddenly, Eleanor's vast French territories were in the hands of the King of England, France's greatest rival. Her second marriage created a massive English empire that controlled more of France than the French king did. This set the stage for centuries of conflict between the two nations. Eleanor's disastrous first wedding and its eventual dissolution fundamentally redrew the map of Europe and created a political crisis for France that would last for generations. For Eleanor, escaping her first marriage was a liberation. For Louis, letting her go was the biggest political blunder of his reign. Number 9 was Empress Josephine's wedding to Napoleon, a calculated risk or a total sham. The marriage certificate for Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine de Beauharnais, signed on March 9th, 1796, was filled with lies. Napoleon, who was 26, added 18 months to his age. Josephine, a 32-year-old widow with 2 children, subtracted 4 years from hers. Even the official who performed the civil ceremony, which started 2 hours late because the groom was busy at work, was a stand-in. The wedding was a hasty, legally dubious affair that reflected the messy, ambitious, and unconventional nature of the couple themselves. It was less a sacred union and more a contract of mutual convenience. Josephine was a survivor. She was born Marie Joseph Rose Taché de la Pagerie on the island of Martinique. Her first husband, Alexandre de Beauharnais, was executed during the French Revolution's reign of terror. She herself was imprisoned and only narrowly escaped the guillotine. When she met Napoleon, she was a prominent figure in the decadent Parisian society that emerged after the terror. She was charming, stylish, and had powerful political connections. She was also older than Napoleon and had a reputation for being extravagant and promiscuous. Napoleon was a brilliant but socially awkward young general on the rise. He was captivated by Josephine's elegance and sophistication. He saw her as his ticket into the upper echelons of French society. He fell deeply in love with her, writing her passionate, almost desperate love letters. Josephine's feelings were more practical. She was not in love with Napoleon. She saw him as a promising protector and a source of financial security for herself and her children. Her friends advised her against marrying the penniless and intense young soldier. She went ahead with it anyway. The wedding itself was a disaster of etiquette. It was a small civil ceremony, not the grand church wedding one might expect. Napoleon's family hated Josephine. They saw her as an old, decadent aristocrat who was not good enough for their brilliant son. They were not present at the wedding. 2 days after the ceremony, Napoleon left to take command of the French army in Italy. His letters from the front were full of desperate love and longing. "I awake full of you," he wrote. "Your portrait and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left my senses no rest." Josephine did not share his passion. She did not write back often. While he was away winning spectacular victories, she began an affair with a young army officer named Hippolyte Charles. The affair became public knowledge. When Napoleon finally found out, he was devastated and humiliated. His love for her turned to cold fury. The passionate foundation of their marriage was destroyed. From that point on, their relationship was a complex mix of affection, ambition, and betrayal. And Napoleon took his own mistresses, but he never stopped relying on Josephine's social grace and political instincts. She was an essential part of his public image as he rose from general to first consul to emperor. She was crowned empress at Notre Dame Cathedral in 1804. But one problem haunted their marriage. Josephine could not give Napoleon an heir. She had 2 children from her first marriage, but she was unable to conceive with Napoleon. As emperor, Napoleon needed a son to secure his dynasty. The lack of an heir was not just a personal disappointment, it was a major political crisis. The future of his empire depended on it. Ultimately, this dynastic need trumped any personal feelings he still had for her. In 1809, after 13 years of marriage, Napoleon announced to a weeping Josephine that he was divorcing her. It was a cold, calculated act of state. He needed a younger wife who could provide a son. The annulment was another legal mess, based on the flimsy excuse that a parish priest had not been present at their original civil ceremony. Napoleon quickly married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, who gave him the son he craved. He remained fond of Josephine, ensuring she kept her titles and a generous income. But she was cast aside. The hasty, dishonest wedding of 1796 had served its purpose for both of them. It had helped him rise to power and given her years of security and status, but it was built on a foundation of lies and unequal affection. The ultimate disaster was that the very thing that made her attractive to him as a her status as a sophisticated older woman, was what made her disposable to him as an emperor. She could not provide the future he needed to build. Number 8. Why was Princess Charlotte of Wales's wedding a national celebration but a personal tragedy? The wedding of Princess Charlotte of Wales to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg on May 2nd, 1816 was a moment of immense public joy. Charlotte was the only child of the hated Prince Regent, the future, George IV, and his estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick. The public adored Charlotte. They saw the lively and headstrong princess as the future hope of the nation, a welcome change from her decadent and dysfunctional parents. Her wedding was seen as a fairy tale. After a previously disastrous arranged engagement to the Prince of Orange, which she had bravely broken off, she was allowed to marry the man she had chosen for herself. The nation celebrated with her. The wedding took place at Carlton House, the Prince Regent's London residence. It was a grand affair. Charlotte wore a silver dress, a departure from the emerging white trend, to show her royal status. Leopold was a handsome but minor German prince. He was penniless but sensible and intelligent. They seemed genuinely in love. Their marriage was a happy one. They settled at Claremont House in Surrey and lived a quiet domestic life away from the toxic politics of the royal court. The public watched them with affection and anticipation. The future of the monarchy rested on Charlotte's shoulders. All hopes were pinned on her producing an heir to secure the line of succession. In early 1817, it was announced that Charlotte was pregnant. The country was ecstatic. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The pregnancy was carefully managed. Charlotte was kept on a strict diet and subjected to regular bleedings, a common but dangerous medical practice of the time. The disaster came in the delivery room. Charlotte went into labor on November 3rd, 1817. The labor was long and difficult. It lasted for over 50 hours. The lead physician, Sir Richard Croft, was a man midwife who followed the prevailing medical theory of non-intervention. He believed nature should be allowed to take its course. He did not use forceps, a tool that was available but considered risky and only for the lower classes. He waited and watched as his royal patient grew more and more exhausted. After 2 days of agonizing labor, Charlotte finally delivered a large baby boy. He was stillborn. The royal nursery, which had been prepared for months, would remain empty. The news was a blow, but Charlotte herself seemed to be recovering. A few hours later, however, she began to complain of stomach pains and shortness of breath. She went into convulsions and died in the early hours of November 6th. She was just 21 years old. The cause of death was likely postpartum hemorrhage and shock. The nation was plunged into a state of profound grief. It was an outpouring of sorrow unlike anything seen before. The public had invested all their hopes in this young woman. Her death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a national catastrophe. Shops closed. The docks fell silent. Everyone, from the richest aristocrat to the poorest laborer, wore black armbands. The country mourned not just a princess, but the future they had lost. The death of both the mother and the heir created a succession crisis. King George III had many sons, but none had a legitimate heir. Charlotte had been the only one in the next generation. Her death set off what became known as the royal baby race. The aging, unmarried royal dukes scrambled to find suitable wives and produce a legitimate child to secure the throne. This frantic scramble eventually led to the marriage of the Duke of Kent and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Their daughter, born in 1819, was named Victoria. She would one day become queen. The fairy tale wedding of Princess Charlotte had ended in the worst possible way. The medical mismanagement of her delivery was a disaster of epic proportions. The doctor, Sir Richard Croft, was consumed by guilt and public blame. A few months later, he took his own life. Charlotte's wedding was a brief moment of happiness and hope, but it led directly to a tragedy that changed the course of British history and broke the nation's heart. Number 7, did Catherine the Great's wedding begin a 17-year Cold War? Catherine the Great's wedding to the future Peter III of Russia on August 21st, 1745, was one of the most lavish spectacles Europe had ever seen. The celebrations lasted for 10 days. There were feasts, masquerade balls, and fireworks. Catherine's wedding dress was made of shimmering silver brocade. But behind the opulent facade, the marriage was a political, personal, and psychological disaster from the very first day. The grand wedding was the beginning of a 17-year-long battle of wills between a brilliant, ambitious woman and her infantile, cruel husband. Catherine was originally a minor German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. She was chosen by Empress Elizabeth of Russia as a bride for her nephew and heir, Peter. The 14-year-old Sophie was brought to Russia, where she threw herself into her new life. She learned the Russian language, converted to the Orthodox faith, taking the name Catherine, and did everything she could to please the Empress and the Russian people. She was intelligent, charming, and determined. Her groom, Peter, was a disaster. He was physically and emotionally immature. He was obsessed with his home country of Holstein and hated Russia. He despised the Orthodox Church and Russian customs. His main passions were playing with toy soldiers and military drills, which he would force his servants and his new wife to participate in for hours on end. He was cruel, foolish, and a heavy drinker. He showed no romantic or physical interest in Catherine. Their wedding night was a humiliating ordeal for the 16-year-old Catherine. Peter got drunk at the wedding banquet, and when he finally came to the bedchamber, he reportedly told his new wife that he was more interested in a new toy servant he had been given. The marriage was not consummated. It would remain unconsummated for years. This left Catherine in a perilous position. Her sole purpose in Russia was to produce an heir. Without a child, her position at court was insecure. She was a foreigner, dependent on the goodwill of the volatile Empress Elizabeth. She lived in a state of constant fear and isolation. Her marriage was a loveless sham. She and Peter lived largely separate lives within the palace, surrounded by spies and court intrigue. Catherine spent these years educating herself. She read voraciously, studying history, law, and the philosophy of the Enlightenment. She cultivated powerful allies at court and in the military. She was playing a long game, preparing herself for a future she knew would be a struggle. She understood that her survival depended on her own intelligence and political skill, not on her useless husband. After 8 years of marriage, under pressure from the Empress, the marriage was finally consummated. Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul, in 1754. But Peter's behavior did not change. He took a mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova, and openly mocked Catherine. When Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter became emperor. His 6-month reign was a catastrophe. He alienated the army, the nobility, and the church with his pro-Prussian policies and his erratic behavior. He threatened to divorce Catherine, lock her in a convent, and marry his mistress. Catherine knew her life was in danger. She had spent 17 years building a network of supporters. With the help of her lover, Grigory Orlov, and his brothers in the Imperial Guard, she staged a coup d'etat. In June 1762, just 6 months after he took the throne, Peter III was arrested and forced to abdicate. Catherine was proclaimed empress and sole ruler of Russia. A few days later, Peter was murdered by his guards. Catherine's disastrous wedding was the crucible that forged her into one of Russia's greatest rulers. The misery and humiliation of her marriage forced her to become self-reliant, ruthless, and politically brilliant. The 17-year Cold War with her husband ended with her complete victory. The wedding that was meant to make her a consort was the first step on her path to becoming an absolute monarch in her own right. Number 6 was Empress Carlota of Mexico's marriage a prelude to madness. The wedding of Princess Charlotte of Belgium to Archduke Maximilian of Austria on July 27, 1857, was a union of two of Europe's most prominent royal houses. Charlotte, known as Carlota, was the daughter of King Leopold I of the Belgians. Maximilian was the younger brother of the powerful Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. The marriage was seen as a brilliant match. They were a young, attractive, and idealistic couple, but their wedding was the first step on a tragic path that would lead them to a phantom throne in a war-torn country, ending in his death by firing squad and her descent into a lifetime of madness. Their early married life was idyllic but unfulfilling. They lived in a beautiful castle, Miramar, on the Adriatic coast. But Maximilian had little real power or responsibility within the Austrian Empire. He was ambitious, a dreamer who longed for a kingdom of his own. Carlota was equally ambitious and fiercely intelligent. She encouraged her husband's dreams. Their disastrous opportunity came in 1863. A group of conservative Mexican monarchists, with the backing of Emperor Napoleon III of France, were looking for a European prince to become the Emperor of Mexico. They offered the crown to Maximilian. It was a hugely risky venture. Mexico was a republic with a long history of political instability. The country was in the middle of a civil war, with Republican forces led by Benito Juarez fighting against the French intervention. Despite warnings from his family and other European leaders, Maximilian accepted the offer. He was lured by the promise of a throne and by Napoleon III's guarantee of French military and financial support. Carlota was a driving force behind the decision. She saw it as their great destiny. In 1864, they sailed from Mexico to become emperor and empress of a country they did not understand, whose people did not want them. Their reign was a disaster from the start. They were seen as foreign puppets of the French. The Republican forces of Juarez controlled large parts of the country and waged a relentless guerrilla war against them. The imperial court they established in Mexico City was an island of European ceremony in a sea of conflict. Maximilian proved to be a well-intentioned but ineffective ruler. His liberal policies alienated his conservative supporters while failing to win over the Republicans. The real catastrophe came in 1866. The United States, its own civil war now over, demanded that France withdraw its troops from Mexico, citing the Monroe Doctrine. Facing pressure from the U.S. and a costly, unwinnable war, Napoleon III abandoned Maximilian. He pulled out the French army, leaving the Mexican Empire defenseless. With their regime on the brink of collapse, Carlota embarked on a desperate mission. She sailed back to Europe to plead for help. She went to Paris to beg Napoleon III to honor his promises. He refused to see her. She then went to Rome to appeal to the Pope. By this point, the immense stress and desperation had taken their toll. Her mind began to unravel. She became paranoid, convinced that Napoleon's spies were trying to poison her. She had a complete mental breakdown in the Vatican. She was never to return to Mexico. Left alone, Maximilian refused to abdicate and flee. He saw it as a matter of honor to stay with his remaining followers. He was captured by Juarez's forces in May 1867. Despite appeals for clemency from across Europe, he was court-martialed and sentenced to death. On June 19, 1867, Emperor Maximilian of Mexico was executed by a firing squad. Carlota never recovered. She was taken back to Belgium, where she lived in seclusion for the next 60 years, lost in a world of delusions, still believing she was the Empress of Mexico. She died in 1927. Her wedding to Maximilian was a union of two bright, ambitious people, but it led them into a disastrous political adventure that they were completely unprepared for. The dream of a crown destroyed them both. Number 5, did a royal wedding guest list spell political doom for Juana of Castile? The wedding of Juana of Castile and Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Austria, in 1496 was a pivotal event in European history. It was a double wedding. Juana's brother John married Philip's sister Margaret of Austria. This alliance between the Spanish crown and the powerful Habsburgs was designed by Juana's parents, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, to encircle their great rival, France. The guest list was a who's who of European power, but the most significant guests politically were the bride and groom themselves. Their union was meant to create a superpower. Instead, it unleashed a personal and political disaster that ended with Juana being imprisoned for nearly 50 years, earning her the tragic nickname Juana la Loca, or Juana the Mad. The marriage started with intense passion when Juana, a deeply religious and serious young woman, met the famously handsome and charming Philip. They were so instantly attracted to each other that they demanded to be married immediately before the planned public ceremony. But the passion soon soured. Philip was a notorious womanizer. His constant infidelities tormented the deeply devoted Juana. Her love for him turned into a frantic, obsessive jealousy. She would fly into rages confronting his alleged mistresses. This erratic behavior was seen as unseemly and unstable by the formal rigid court. The political disaster began with a series of unexpected deaths in the Spanish royal family. Juana's only brother, John, died. Then her older sister, Isabella, died. Then Isabella's young son, Miguel, died. Suddenly, Juana, who had been a younger daughter with little prospect of ruling, was the heir to the vast Spanish Empire. This dramatically raised the stakes of her marriage. Her husband Philip was now in line to become the King of Castile. Philip and his Flemish courtiers saw this as a golden opportunity. They began to maneuver to seize power for themselves. They started to spread rumors that Juana was mentally unstable and unfit to rule. Her jealous rages and public outbursts were used as evidence of her madness. It is impossible to know for sure the true state of Juana's mental health. She may have suffered from a genuine mental illness like depression or schizophrenia. But it is also clear that her political enemies, including her husband and later her own father, deliberately exaggerated and exploited her emotional distress for their own political gain. The situation came to a head in 1504 when Queen Isabella died. Her will named Juana as her successor, but it also contained a clause stating that if Juana was unwilling or unable to rule, her father Ferdinand should act as regent. This was the opening Philip needed. He and Ferdinand battled for control of Castile, with the unfortunate Juana caught in the middle. In 1506, Philip and Juana sailed to Spain to claim their inheritance. Philip died suddenly of a fever shortly after their arrival. Juana's grief was profound and theatrical. She refused to let his body be buried for months, traveling with his coffin across the countryside. This macabre procession was seen as the ultimate proof of her madness. With Philip dead, Juana's father, Ferdinand, stepped in. He declared his daughter mentally unfit and had her confined to a castle in Tordesillas. He then ruled Castile as regent. When Ferdinand died, Juana's own son, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, continued her imprisonment. He needed to secure his own claim to the Spanish throne and could not risk his mother challenging his authority. Juana remained locked away in Tordesillas for 46 years until her death in 1555. Her wedding, which was meant to be the cornerstone of a grand political alliance, became her personal undoing. Her passionate love for her husband turned into a weapon that was used against her. She was a queen who was never allowed to rule, a political pawn declared mad by the three most important men in her life: her husband, her father, and her son. Number 4, why did Grace Kelly's wedding have 2 disastrous ceremonies? The wedding of American movie star Grace Kelly to Prince Rainier III of Monaco in April 1956 was a global media event, the epitome of fairytale glamour. But behind the scenes, it was a stressful, complicated, and contractually obligated affair with 2 separate ceremonies, one of which the bride reportedly hated. The first disaster was the marriage contract itself. It included a clause requiring Grace to undergo a fertility test to prove she could produce an heir for the tiny principality. If she couldn't, the marriage would not happen. It also required her family to pay a dowry of $2 million, a huge sum at the time. The wedding was split into 2 parts because of Monaco's legal requirements under the Napoleonic Code. The first ceremony, on April 18th, was a civil service held in the throne room of the Palace of Monaco. It was a cold, formal, and bureaucratic event. Grace wore a simple beige lace dress with a matching hat. The ceremony was conducted in French and lasted just 16 minutes. Grace later described it as uncharming and impersonal. This was the legally binding part of the wedding, but for the American actress used to Hollywood spectacle, it was a deeply anticlimactic and disappointing experience. The second ceremony, on April 19th, was the religious one that the world remembers. It was held at St. Nicholas Cathedral and was a masterpiece of public relations, orchestrated by Hollywood studio MGM. MGM had a vested interest in the wedding. As part of a deal to release Grace from her film contract, the studio was given exclusive filming rights to the event. They treated it like a movie production. The guest list of 600 included Hollywood royalty like Cary Grant and Ava Gardner, alongside European aristocrats. The cathedral was filled with television cameras, and the event was broadcast to an estimated 30 million viewers. This level of media scrutiny created its own disasters. The logistics were a nightmare. Monaco was overwhelmed by thousands of journalists and photographers. The pressure on Grace was immense. She was not just a bride, she was the star of a global spectacle. Her famous wedding dress, a gift from MGM, was designed by Helen Rose. It was an incredibly complex garment made with 25 yards of silk taffeta and 100 yards of silk net. But the stress of the situation was visible. In photographs, Grace often looks strained and overwhelmed rather than joyful. There were also personal tensions. Prince Rainier was reportedly uncomfortable with the Hollywood-style takeover of his national event. He and his family were used to a more staid and private European royal style. The clash of cultures between the Grimaldi dynasty and the Hollywood machine was a constant source of friction. Even the honeymoon was a disaster. The couple sailed away on their yacht, the Deo Juvante II, a gift from Aristotle Onassis. They were supposed to enjoy a peaceful cruise around the Mediterranean. Instead, they were relentlessly pursued by the press in boats and helicopters. The constant intrusion made it impossible for them to have any privacy. It was a stressful and frustrating start to their married life. The fairy tale wedding was, in many ways, a high-pressure business deal and a media circus that sacrificed personal intimacy for public spectacle. The two ceremonies represented the two conflicting worlds Grace Kelly was trying to bridge: the cold, legal reality of becoming a princess and the manufactured, glamorous image the world demanded. Number 3 was Princess Diana's wedding dress, a design disaster. Princess Diana's wedding dress is one of the most iconic garments in history. The fairy tale ball gown with its 25-foot train, designed by the then unknown David and Elizabeth Emanuel, seemed perfect for the wedding of the century on July 29th, 1981. But on the day, the dress itself was a source of several small disasters. The biggest problem was the fabric. It was made of ivory silk taffeta, a material that creases very easily. The designers had not fully accounted for the tiny space inside the glass coach that would carry Diana and her father to St. Paul's Cathedral. When she emerged from the coach, the dress and the massive train were badly wrinkled and crushed. The perfect, smooth silhouette seen in sketches and fittings was gone, replaced by a mass of crumpled fabric. The secrecy surrounding the dress also created problems. The designers were so paranoid about leaks to the press that they took extreme measures. They kept the design in a safe and even threw out decoy sketches in the trash to mislead reporters. This meant that very few people had seen the final dress in its full glory. There was no proper dress rehearsal of getting in and out of the coach. If there had been, the creasing problem might have been anticipated and addressed. There were other small mishaps. Diana had accidentally spilled some Quecque Le Fleur's perfume down the front of the dress while getting ready. She tried to cover the spot with her hand as she walked down the aisle. The dress was also a very tight fit. In the months leading up to the wedding, the shy 20-year-old Diana, under immense stress, had lost a significant amount of weight. Her waist had shrunk from 29 inches to 23.5 inches. The dress had to be repeatedly altered and was even sewn into on the final day to ensure a perfect fit. This dramatic weight loss was a sign of the immense personal turmoil she was experiencing. But the real disaster of the wedding was not the wrinkled dress or the spilled perfume. It was the emotional state of the bride and groom. We now know that both Charles and Diana had serious doubts about the marriage. Diana had discovered a bracelet that Charles had bought for his former girlfriend, Camilla Parker Bowles, just days before the wedding. She was devastated and wanted to call the whole thing off. Her sisters reportedly told her it was too late, as her face was on the tea towels. Charles, for his part, was under immense pressure from his family to marry and produce an heir. He was still in love with Camilla. In an interview before the wedding, when a reporter asked if they were in love, Diana immediately said, "Of course." Charles famously added the awkward and deeply revealing phrase, "whatever in love means." It was a jarring and ominous comment that hinted at the emotional chasm between them. During the ceremony itself, a nervous Diana mixed up her husband's names, calling him Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip Arthur George. Charles forgot to kiss his bride at the end of the ceremony. They made up for it later with the famous kiss on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, a moment that was not part of the traditional protocol, but was a response to the demands of the cheering crowd. The wedding was watched by an estimated global audience of 750 million people. It was a perfect piece of public theater, a national celebration that seemed to unite the country. But it was a fairy tale built on a foundation of doubt, jealousy, and incompatibility. The creased dress was a fitting metaphor for the marriage itself. From a distance, it looked spectacular and perfect, but up close, it was full of flaws and wrinkles, a sign of the immense pressure and hidden unhappiness at its core. Number 2. Did a drunken groom ruin Queen Alexandra's big day? The wedding of Princess Alexandra of Denmark to Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, on March 10th, 1863, was a day of national celebration. The 18-year-old Danish princess was stunningly beautiful and had captured the hearts of the British public. But the ceremony at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, was overshadowed by grief, political tension, and the bad behavior of one very important guest, the German prince, who would one day become Kaiser Wilhelm II. The entire event was held under the shadow of Queen Victoria's deep mourning for her husband, Prince Albert, who had died just 15 months earlier. The Queen was still consumed by grief. She insisted the wedding be a relatively private affair at Windsor, not a grand public spectacle in London. She also decreed that no one should wear bright colors. The court was still officially in mourning. This cast a somber mood over what should have been a joyous occasion. During the ceremony, the Queen watched, not from the royal pew, but from a private gallery above, hidden from view like a sorrowful ghost. Her presence was a constant reminder of the recent tragedy. The political situation was also a disaster. The bride was Danish. A major political crisis was brewing between Denmark and Prussia over the territories of Schleswig-Holstein. The marriage was, deeply unpopular in Prussia and the other German states. The groom's older sister, Princess Victoria Vicky, was married to the Crown Prince of Prussia. This placed the family on opposite sides of a looming conflict. The wedding guest list was a diplomatic minefield full of relatives who were on the verge of becoming political enemies. The worst behavior of the day came from Vicky's 4-year-old son, the young Prince Wilhelm of Prussia. The future Kaiser was a difficult and disruptive child. During a long ceremony, he became bored and restless. He bit his uncles, the Duke of Coburg and the Duke of Cambridge, on their legs. He played with the ceremonial dirk of his Highland outfit and threw it across the chapel floor, where it clattered loudly, disrupting the solemn vows. His behavior was a source of acute embarrassment for his parents and a major breach of royal decorum. It was a small, childish tantrum, but it was a disruptive and disrespectful act at the heart of the royal family's big day. The groom himself was no angel. Bertie, as the Prince of Wales was known, was a notorious playboy. His father, Prince Albert, had died shortly after visiting him at Cambridge to reprimand him for an affair with an actress. The Queen Victoria irrationally blamed her son for her husband's death, believing the stress of the scandal had killed him. The marriage to Alexandra was an attempt to settle him down and reform his character. It didn't work. And Bertie's lifelong infidelities were a constant source of pain for Alexandra, though she bore them with public dignity. The wedding, therefore, was not the happy, hopeful event it appeared to be. It was an occasion marked by a grieving, controlling mother-in-law, explosive international politics, and a badly behaved child who would one day become a major antagonist to Britain. The beautiful bride was marrying into a family defined by sorrow and dysfunction, and a political situation that was about to erupt into war. The ceremony at Windsor was a brief, formal pause in a world of personal grief and political chaos. Number 1. Why was Queen Isabella's marriage a secret and a legal gamble? The marriage of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon on October 19th, 1469, was one of the most consequential in history. It led to the unification of Spain, the completion of the Reconquista, the expulsion of the Jews, and the funding of Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. But the wedding itself was a clandestine, illegal, and incredibly risky affair that could have easily ended in disaster, with the bride and groom imprisoned or worse. The marriage was a political masterstroke, but it was done in defiance of Isabella's own brother, King Henry IV of Castile. Henry wanted his half-sister and heir to marry someone he could control, like the elderly King of Portugal or a French duke. Isabella, a strong-willed and pious 18-year-old, had other ideas. She was determined to marry the 17-year-old Ferdinand, the heir to the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. She saw that their union would create a powerful Christian kingdom capable of uniting the Iberian Peninsula. To get married, they had to overcome huge obstacles. First, Isabella had to escape from the watchful eye of her brother's court. She claimed she was going to visit her mother's tomb and fled to the city of Valladolid, which was controlled by her supporters. Second, Ferdinand had to travel to her in secret. He disguised himself as a servant, traveling with a group of merchants through hostile Castilian territory. It was a dangerous journey. If he had been recognized, he would have been arrested. The biggest obstacle was the Catholic Church. Isabella and Ferdinand were second cousins. According to canon law, they were too closely related to marry without a special dispensation from the Pope. King Henry IV had made sure the Pope would not grant one. He wanted to block the marriage. Without the papal bull of dispensation, any wedding ceremony would be illegal and the marriage invalid. Any children they had would be considered illegitimate. This is where the disaster was narrowly averted by a clever and audacious forgery. Ferdinand and the Archbishop of Toledo, one of Isabella's key supporters, produced a fake papal bull. They claimed it had been issued by the previous pope and gave them permission to marry. It was a complete fabrication, a piece of high-stakes deception. Most people present probably knew it was a fake, but they went along with it because they supported the marriage. The wedding itself was a rushed and modest affair, held in the palace of a nobleman in Valladolid. It was not a grand royal wedding. It was a secret, illegal ceremony between two young rebels who were betting everything on their political future. They had very little money. A story, possibly a legend, says they had to borrow money for the wedding celebrations. The aftermath was immediate and dangerous. When King Henry IV learned of the secret marriage, he was furious. He publicly disinherited Isabella and named his own daughter, Juana, as his heir. This set the stage for a civil war. When Henry died in 1474, the War of the Castilian Succession broke out between the supporters of Isabella and the supporters of Juana, who was backed by Portugal. Isabella and Ferdinand eventually won the war. Their illegal and secret marriage was later validated by a genuine papal bull from the new pope, Sixtus IV, who recognized that they were the winning side. Their risky gamble had paid off. The clandestine wedding, based on a forgery and held in defiance of their king, laid the foundation for modern Spain. But it was a disaster waiting to happen, a desperate political act that could have easily ended with their defeat and disgrace.